person to die. And I love this portrait because it sort of tells you who this person was when he went off to war. I mean, obviously he's dressed, it's probably his high school photo. He's dressed with this nice, neat white collar, his earnest expression. And so you can imagine dozens and dozens of these young men going off to war. This battlefield was pretty ragged, so we're not exactly sure who died exactly when. Some people remained on the battlefield for quite a while, including young Lester Bishop, who was just barely, not even 18. I don't know how he got in, but he went to war when he was 17 and a half. And he probably was on the battlefield for about 3 days before he got out. So these young men on this list were all buried in France at the Musargon Cemetery, which is a very stately and beautifully austere place. And we have other men that are also buried all through France. While the Musargon was going on, there were other battles on other parts of France, so we had other casualties as well. I think one of the moments of grace in this dreadful war were the Red Cross nurses who took care of these young men that came into the casualty field stations, and there were dozens and dozens of American hospitals all over France. This is just a little bit of a letter from Margaret Strode, a Red Cross nurse, to the parents of Lester Bishop. And I won't read it because I get kind of weepy on this one, but I think you can read it, and what it says is there were moments of grace amid all this horror, and you read in these letters from these young men a lot of that the Red Cross nurses were so important to them. So I'd like to think that, you know, they found grace not only from their own fellow soldiers, but also from these nurses. So one of the good letter writers was this young man, Howard Cecil Bennett. He worked at a Bennett's shoe store in Grass Valley. And he wrote home a lot. One of the qualities of these letters was that, I think probably this is true with war today, these young men didn't want their parents to worry. So every wound was slight. Every nurse was wonderful. Every hospital was efficient. But nevertheless, you know, when you realize what they were suffering from, that they probably weren't all slight. So I'm just going to read something from Howard. He was at the Musargon and was wounded, and made his way back to the hospitals. But he starts out by saying, of course, I shouldn't have told you that I was wounded. I don't want you to worry, but I knew the military would tell you anyway, so that's why I told you. But then he says, now this is written on Christmas Day, following the Musargon. It took 30 days sometimes for a letter to get back because they were all censored. So he wrote this, which I thought was very touching. Next, I wanted to say a few words about our boys as fighters, and a few words about the reverence shown our honored dead. For men who have not been under military rule and trained as rapidly as our boys were, we have an army that cannot be surpassed in the world today. Our boys have a daring that is marvel to all. Retreat is not in the vocabulary that they are, can't quite read that word, oh well. I don't say these remarks to boast, but because they are almost, because we accomplished so little in so little time. Then he says, I may have to stay in the hospital another 3 weeks, but if I don't, I'll get back to the front. but by this time the war is over. So I'm not sure what front he's talking about. So Armistice, the treaty that brought it into the fighting on the Western Front happened the 11th hour of the 11th day. This is the rail car where this hurried up armistice was negotiated. Well, it wasn't negotiated. The Germans came to General Foch and said, "What are your terms?" Or "Here are our terms." And he said, "You have no terms. There's just our terms." And that would come out to haunt the world later. This is a scene of Armistice Day at the front. So these guys are happy to be sure. In Grass Valley and Nevada City and other parts of the county, word came in about 1 in the morning. The Union put out a special edition, which is still in a frame in Brian Hamilton's office at the Union. But by dawn, everybody was up and about and parading around, and the celebration went on into the night. The bank building on Mill Street was lit up. The Kaiser was hung in effigy in more than one place, I'm sure. And a contingent of Grass Valley people not content to be done got in their cars and drove over the Pine Street Bridge into Nevada City to keep celebrating. And as Gage has pointed out, I'm not sure on what occasion, but it really struck me, that doesn't mean that people weren't still dying or coming home. And which Kneebone was it? I can't recall. One of the Kneebone boys, his train with his coffin arrived that night in town. So, and a lot of people would not hear about the status of their young people until well into December. So very soon after the war, the people in Grass Valley decided they needed a memorial. And a number of the mines and the citizens raised funds to build a park, memorial park. This young man's, Heron King, was in the Navy. He died in a hospital in the States of a disease, probably pneumonia, I think it was. And that clock on the right, which you can still see, that stone clock on the right, was put up in his honor. In 1927, the veterans of the American Legion, Post 130, which was then named Thomas Haggerty, or Thomas Haggerty Haig, were three of our young men that died, decided to build the Veterans Hall. And it looks incredibly small here to me, but it was clean. It wasn't done yet. That's still construction. But in 1932, they had the grand opening. And they had 700 dancers on the floor. They had another, I think they thought 500 people up in the bleachers. And the Drum and Bugle Corps came out with a stirring march, and then the lights went down, and they played taps for the lost from the war. And most of these men in the Bugle Corps were in the war together. So where does that leave us with remembering this war and these veterans? This is Memorial Park Grove. I hope you've all been there, but if not, take a wander through. Not all of Grass Valley's veterans who died in the war are honored in this park. And one woman has since been honored, Alina Hill, a nurse who died in the United States but was in service. But other than that, the memories are scattered at different places. The graveyards certainly have an abundance of war dead. Trying to record in my database where these folks are buried. But I think as we approach Veterans Day, Armistice Day, it is worth thinking about why we don't remember this war. And it began, not, if this is double negative, but bear with me, it wasn't remembered very soon after it was over. And I have read in several legitimate history texts that at West Point, they didn't teach the Muzargon. They were still teaching Gettysburg in the classes in the 1930s. So this war began to be forgotten fairly quickly. And like most veterans, I would guess these veterans didn't want to talk about what they'd seen. What they'd seen was pretty awful. But I think that we owe them to remember it, not for the horrors that they saw or experienced, but because they left here hopeful and thinking they were off to do something good. So I hope that you will think about them and remember them. And I was utterly surprised when I went out to the park this week. This is a little basin. There is also a memorial there that has a plaque with 16 people that are honored in the grove. And there's like a little basin. And much to my surprise, in this basin were some notes. The largest one on the right is a handwritten copy of In Flanders Field, probably the most important, well-remembered poem from this era. And the ones on the left just had little bits and pieces of information about the war. So I don't know, and they're in different hands, so I don't know who left them or why they left them, but I would love to know. I've asked Lance Lowe at Grass Valley City to put me in touch with a park custodian to see if this happens regularly or if it just happened this one time. So I was sort of cheered that somebody is still visiting the park and still remembering them. And I'd like to thank you very much for your attention. Happy to take any questions. May I just take a second to thank a few people too. Heather, Debbie, not sure who else might be here who's contributing artifacts to us to put in our exhibit. So thank you very much. We look forward to having some personal items that we can share as part of our exhibit. So any questions?
Is Memorial Grove under siege? I don't know about the story behind the pickleball court.
No, I don't think it was intentionally under siege. The tree that Anthony Bevilacqua, his tree apparently is ill, and they did, the park is meant to be a living thing, and when it was new there were picnic tables. I mean, it wasn't a memorial per se, it was a living park for the living. So I think the intent was to add a pickleball court somewhere, and I think they just kind of didn't think that one through. They did talk to some veterans who said, oh, no problem, and then some other veterans said, big problem. But it all got resolved in the pickleball court someplace else. So I think everybody had goodwill, and once it was obvious that was an issue, it got resolved. So everybody sort of heard that way. Heather, yes. Well, if you go into the park, you know where the swimming pool is?
Which park?
Memorial Park in Grass Valley. Yeah. It's very near the pool. If you get to the pool, the park's right there, or the grove's right there. Yes?
Other than age and gender, what would exempt you from the draft in the
There were a number of reasons you could be exempt from the draft, and they did change over the course of the draft. Theoretically, if you were the sole support of like your mother or children, you could be exempt. Certain occupations were exempt. I think ministers were exempt, as I recall. But the local draft boards sort of got to decide that. And some of the only real controversies I read about the draft were that local draft boards were favoring their cronies to give them exemptions. Yes?
There was a picture at the end when the war was over, the people in town, and several of them had masks on. Do you know why?
Sorry?
There several people had masks on.
Oh, yes. I'm sorry. I should have, it was a big one. There's a lot I left out. I apologize for that. But that was a big one to leave out. The influenza epidemic, called Spanish flu, although nothing to do with Spain, swept through the whole world, well, swept across the world. And Nevada City, or Nevada County, was in the middle of the epidemic in the summer and fall of 1918. And public gatherings were supposedly prohibited. Even things like enrolling bandages for soldiers rather than doing them in the basement of the library as they had been done, people were asked to take piecework home. So funerals, you weren't supposed to go to funerals, weren't supposed to go to church services. So people mistakenly thought the mask would protect them from the flu, which it didn't. But it was, I don't know, I think there were like 200, more than 200 deaths, is that about right, in Nevada County from influenza. So you can imagine the poor community suffering from that on top of what was going on overseas. Yes.
What part of France is Moussargot?
It's about 45 miles out of Paris. I think you'd probably call it northeast France, Champagne, Lorraine, that general area. Thank you very much.
I don't know about you guys, but I was riveted to my seat. I looked at the clock, it was an hour. That went by so fast. That was amazing. All right, so if you want to get your raffle tickets out. Yes.
I'll tell you what we've got in here.
Oh, cool.
This is a World War II basket, I guess. So we have some Belgian truffles, deck playing cards with World War I. There are now some new stamps out for World War I. And a wonderful book written by Stanford historian David Kennedy called Over Here. Plus, somewhere back there, we have the poppy umbrella.
Oh, I didn't know. Someone know where the umbrella went? Oh, there we go. Oh, okay. All right. Oh, you want a package card? Yeah.
4100794. That too good? 4100794.
Last three digits are 794.
Oh, birthday, yay! She deserves it, because she wrote that wonderful press release about the program.
Oh, thank you. All right. Well, here I see. Yeah, yes. Here you go. Oh, and your umbrella. Thank you for coming tonight.
Good to you.